Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering.
On this episode, we speak with Auren Hoffman, the CEO of SafeGraph, a data-as-a-service company that curates and sells data about physical places. Auren has been in the data industry for a long time, as he was previously the CEO and co-founder of LiveRamp, a data enablement platform that he sold to Acxiom for over $300 million. We've seen a growing buzz around companies buying and selling third-party data, both through marketplaces and directly between producers and consumers. So on this episode, we go deeper into those trends and learn more about the industry of data as a service.
So I don't know if you had the same experience that I did on this episode, but a lot of times we talk to people that I have overlapping expertise with them. So like we talk about databases or we talk whatever, and these are like things that I have some knowledge about. On this episode, I felt like a kid in a candy store. I was just like learning all the time. I really don't know that much about the economics of a company that sells data. I haven't done a lot of buying of third-party data. It's a whole world that I just don't know that much about, and I really enjoyed the opportunity to pick Auren's brain and just have him educate me.
Yeah, he kind of downplays it a little bit in saying that there's not a big industry here, but there are actually like multiple $10 billion plus companies that just sell data, and it's a very different practice of how do you get data in a good shape than when you're talking about first-party data. So I found it super interesting, and he's just this wealth of knowledge. So I very much enjoyed this episode as well. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Welcome to the show, Auren. It's good to have you. I just want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself because I primarily know you through Twitter to date.
That's how my kids and my wife knows me too, I think.
But when I was digging deeper into your background, I realized that you have quite a set of things that you've done over your career. So I could just give you the floor here. How do you describe your background?
I currently run a company called SafeGraph. We sell geospatial data about physical places. And then before that was the CEO of LiveRamp, which is the largest middleware company for marketing technology companies.
And I think thrown in there, you started your first business in college. Is that right?
I had to pay my way through college. So I actually started a business in high school, which gave me the savings to pay for college, which was really nice. So I could spend more time drinking some beer in college and didn't have to work for the first couple of years of college.
Nice. I did go all the way back to the beginning of your LinkedIn bio, as you can see. And I noticed that between your first job and your second job, there was meaningful career progression because in your first job, the description was coded 18 hours a day. And then the second job, the description was coded 17 hours a day.
Oh, yeah. So, okay. I like it. That's
real progress. But so you've been doing this for a little while. So you were talking about geospatial data. I think LiveRamp is also in the data enablement, data activation. I don't know how you want to.
Yeah, correct. So LiveRamp is a middleware company where it moves data between marketing applications. So most of the large B2C companies, Walmart, United Airlines, American Express, Marriott, et cetera, move their data to all their various marketing applications using LiveRamp. And LiveRamp's a public company and trades under RAMP.
Got it. So to contrast LiveRamp and SafeGraph, LiveRamp helps you with first-party data as a company, and SafeGraph is third-party data. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. So LiveRamp is basically a middleware, so it helps you kind of like move around your data, and SafeGraph is just a data company. So we're literally just selling you facts about physical places. So like the store hours, where all these places are, the categories, the phone numbers, like the address, like this like kind of very, very boring data about a physical place is what we sell.
So we're going to talk a lot about buying, selling, sharing data on this episode. And it's a little bit different than some of our past episodes where we usually talk about what do you do with your own data. In this episode, we're going to talk about, well, how do you actually incorporate third-party data that you might not have access to yourself? And I want to ground people in like, who are we actually talking about? Like, who are some of the biggest buyers of third-party data? Because I think for lots of companies, they're still thinking about what do they do with their own data, and they haven't yet gone on that journey of what other data sources do I need.
And by the way, that's the right thing. So there's like a data maturity curve. And you shouldn't be going out and buying external data until you could work with your own data. So if you're a retailer, you have a lot of great data that's coming in. You have data about, your employees and what's happening and who's worked out. You have data about your ingredients. You have data about, your pricing. You have data about when customers are coming. You have all this other amazing data to mine. Like you should get fairly along on that curve of mining that first before you bring in external data. Once you've gotten pretty far along, then it makes sense to start bringing in external data. And most companies are not that far on the curve yet. So they're getting there. You could see a path where companies are moving further and further along, but very few companies. So if you think of almost any industry, it's still a very small percentage of organizations in that industry that can buy external data. Even if you think about hedge funds, there's about 100 hedge funds that buy external data in any meaningful way today, and there's 11,000 total hedge funds. So we're talking about under 1% of hedge funds really can buy that today. Now, there's probably another 500 that will be buying it in the future, but they're not there yet. And hedge funds don't even have any internal data at all. So they don't even have a good excuse. When you think about a retailer, you're really talking about 20 or 30 major retailers that can buy external data today. Most of the other ones aren't that far on. If you think about real estate, it's basically zero that can really use that. So there's almost, most industries, it's still only a small percentage can buy data today.
Got it. I often think first about hedge funds as like one of the biggest buyers of third-party data because they don't have their own data and they are constantly looking to find an edge on the market or have some kind of unique insight that their others don't really see.
The total data budget from hedge funds is minuscule.
It's tiny.
It's so small.
So is retail bigger than them, or like who is buying all this data?
Very few people are buying data. So just the number of
this is your business we're talking about.
Yeah, the market is very small. So if you look at the number of data companies that have been started in the last 20 years that have become unicorns, you're really talking about one or two. It's like Zoom Info, and maybe you can think of another one. So it's whereas you think of the number of SaaS companies in the last 20 years that have become uniforms, it's about 1,000. So much easier. So a lot of companies that had proprietary data, instead of becoming a data company, they often would like bundle it with some software and build a solution on top of it and sell a solution rather than the data, because then you really expand your TAM. Now, we think this is a good time to start a data company because just the number of data buyers is growing quite a bit. It's still really tiny. It's growing, but the total addressable market to sell data is very small today because most buyers are just not yet sophisticated enough to buy data.
Yeah, we had Julie from Clearbit on the show last season, and we talked a lot about how they're really trying to provide a marketing solution on top of just the data they sell. And I think that's probably the first channel that people purchase is like marketing enrichment so they can go after better demand gen. But beyond that, I think people are still trying to figure out what their needs are and whether they would benefit from procuring more data.
Are there just opportunities lying around in front of every single business, but they are just not seeing them? They're like, generic software company, let's just take us for a second. Are we supposed to be buying data sets right now and we just don't even realize it?
Well, potentially. I mean, a lot of people buy like a little bit of data here and there. As Julia mentioned, you buy data about like leads or something like that, right?
Yeah. I think that we have some firmographic information to do like enrichment on companies.
Yeah, exactly. Some people will buy data to like augment their sales or marketing efforts. And that's a pretty common practice, but it's still like your budget. Most companies' budget for that is very small and probably should be relatively small as well. Sometimes it's baked into what they're already doing. Obviously, if you're doing advertising on Facebook, like data is baked in to it. You don't really think of it as buying like data that's out there. But yeah, for most companies, like it really depends on are you building a solution? And then if you're building a solution, maybe some external data could really inform that. So obviously, if you're in the real estate world, if you had data, if you think, so let's take a step back. There's 4 nouns of data. So you have data about people. You have data about places. So that's what SafeGraph does. You have data about companies, like you mentioned firmographic data or stock ticker data or something like that. And then you have data about products. 99% of data is in one of those 4 nouns. And then you can cross those with each other. You can also cross it with time, and you can cross it with price. So if you think of a stock ticker data would be, the noun would be company, and then it would be crossed with price and with time, right? And you can go back 100 years and you could back test your AT&T ticker. Now, maybe the tick 100 years ago is every 24 hours, and the tick today is every 24 milliseconds or something. But the data is very, very similar, and that data is fairly accurate data to use.
I want to talk then maybe on the supply side, because lots of companies produce data. Some data sets are unique or hard to come by. And I used to be an investor a while back, and every company that came in to pitch was like, they had their primary business, and the last couple of pages on their slide deck would be like, and then we'll be a data company that will sell it, and this will be a new revenue stream. And we saw like all kinds of really bizarre pitches of, we're going to put sensors on garbage bins, and then we'll know traffic for the city, and we'll sell that to retailers, and retailers will want to know where traffic is in Manhattan. I made that example up. But like we would hear like lots and lots of pitches of, and we are going to be a data company and we're going to sell the data. But that vision never really materialized in a lot of ways. We didn't see this explosion of people becoming data sellers. Why is that? Was it just like prioritization? The demand wasn't there, regulatory reasons? What happened?
So there's a few reasons. First, almost all great software companies have amazing data, but they're often unwilling to sell their amazing data because that data is proprietary to them and helps empower those types of things, et cetera. So yes, Salesforce has like incredible data about all this stuff. First of all, they don't always have the rights to sell that data, even if they wanted to. So in Salesforce's case, they explicitly don't have the rights to sell even aggregated data about what's going on. And then secondly, even if they did, they might want to keep it internally and not let other people type of sell it. So that's one thing, is you always have this like internal difficulties to selling it and resistance to selling data internally from your product team, from your sales team, et cetera, because they think it might be harder to sell your core product. The second is selling data is a very, very, very different muscle than selling software, because data is an ingredient. It's not a solution. And so if you think of like, we like to say we sell high quality butter to pastry chefs. Just because you have high quality butter does not mean you're going to end up with like a flaky, beautiful, amazing croissant. It's a necessary ingredient to an incredible croissant. But you still need an incredible chef with many, many other really great ingredients to make that great croissant. And so data is just an ingredient, whereas most software companies is the solution. So you need a very, very different sales process, a different sales team doing that. You can't just like add it on to what you're doing. So it's essentially a separate company, often with like a separate DNA. And so for a lot of those reasons is why we haven't really seen these extra layers of revenue coming from a traditional software company.
Got it. So data is their competitive moat a lot of times, and they don't want to give that away to their competitors.
It may not even be, but someone may think it is internally.
Okay. You also mentioned they may not have the right to sell that data or might be anonymized. Who's protecting our data? I guess for me, I've always been maybe not as conscious about it. I'm like, if people have my data, maybe I'll get a better personalized ad or a better personalized experience. So it doesn't concern me as much, but I think that's likely because I grew up in the United States, where I have some trust in how people are using that data responsibly. But if you go to other countries, certainly people having your data can be a real risk to security, and the risk is much higher. Who's protecting our data, and how is that evolving over the years?
In your question, you're thinking about, you're really thinking about the first noun of data, which is data about people.
Yeah.
Which is a piece of the data business, but it's only a piece. And that's really generally, most of that is for marketing purposes, where people will try to sell that data for marketing purposes. So they might say, okay, we have some data about Julia. Julia is a woman. She's in tech. And therefore, if you're marketing to Julia, you might want to market her different than you market to, my 80-year-old grandfather or something like that. And so they might use that for different types of things. The data about people is very regulated. And then you can move into areas where like medical data or something like that, where there are very, very, very clear rules about what you can do and how you can do it and how you can move it and what you can do with that type of data. But even in marketing, which is much less regulated, you still have quite a few regulations about what you can do, how you can do it. And there's a lot of rules about it, both in the US and overseas and even in California, they have CCPA. There's all these other types of things. Some of the more interesting data is not data about people, but some of these other types of things. And even there, the data might be proprietary. So a lot of times your company might be using a product, and that product is collecting data about your company. And then you still want to have some sort of a surety about how they use your data, right? So you can imagine if you have your data in QuickBooks, so you have all your financial data in QuickBooks, there is, you probably want to know that they're not going to just like sell off, your revenues to like some investor or something like that. But you might be okay if they just aggregate it and they say startups with this number of people have these types of expenses, that you might be okay with. So there's always these things that you have to understand, and all these data rights are often changing. And so understanding that is important. Because most companies don't sell data, they're usually in the sales process happy to not negotiate for rights to the data.
Let's talk about SafeGraph for just a second. We've been talking about the class of companies who really started out with a vision to create, as you're talking about it, a solution, a technology solution. The data is kind of something that comes through the process of creating that solution. But my understanding is that you started SafeGraph explicitly with the intent to curate a data set and monetize it. How does one go about doing that? Because you're talking about QuickBooks, right? So how does QuickBooks get a bunch of data? It's like, well, you create a software that you use for accounting. A lot of people do that, and then you have a lot of data. But if you don't have that type of users coming to you and supplying you with all the data, you have to figure out how to go out and get it.
I mean, there's lots of ways to get data. So what is like Associated Press? It's just a data company, right? It's spitting out facts about things that happened. And so you could have people go gather it. You can crawl the internet to get data. You can ask people to contribute it in some sort of data co-op or some sort of, so there's lots of different strategies to go get data. You can even create synthetic data on top of real data, which could be really interesting. And that might be a privacy safe way if you had like access to medical data, but you still wanted researchers to be able to take a look at it, you can create synthetic data on top of it. So there's lots of different ways of like making data products. In our case, like we get most of our data from crawling. So we do a lot of internet crawling to try to find a lot of interesting data, whether it's understanding like the local McDonald's to understanding the city of San Francisco or the city of Berlin, getting data from job boards. There's lots of different places where we'll have interesting data about physical places, and we want to make sure that we get that data and then aggregate it. One of the hard parts, the most important thing about a data company is that the data is true. And people always forget that. That's like the number one, it sounds obvious, but it's literally the number one thing. It's like, if you're selling facts, you want your facts to be true. Now, if you're selling billions and billions of facts, as we are in SafeGraph, you'll never be 100% true. You'll never be close. But that should be your objective. Your objective should be like, when you're wrong, to fix it quickly, to try to, really work on everything that have a really good QA system, et cetera, because people want to rely on that data. They want to build models on that data. If you're building models and you start timesing 0.9 against each other a bunch of times, you get a small number really, really, really fast. So you want to have as high accuracy as possible from the get-go.
So if you're looking at a product that builds a solution, you've got an engineering team, and in that engineering team, there will be people that are responsible for feature A and feature B and feature C. And, those features are generally like pretty customer facing. And then there's a team that kind of like makes sure that there's infrastructure or whatever. The way that I'm hearing you talk about the kind of work that is involved in curating a data set is like, maybe there's the crawling team, and maybe there's the data storage team, and maybe there's the quality team or something. Is this the kind of way that you think about the work?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, you have to get the data. And so maybe you're buying data, maybe you're crawling for data, maybe you're getting data from many, many different places. So there's like a data source where you may be bringing in data from hundreds of thousands of sources. And you're bringing in data from all these different places. And then, of course, that data is coming in messy, so you have to transform it. And then there's some sort of like ML team, as you mentioned, is kind of the next step to try to make sure, okay, like what's good, what's not good, what should we trust, what shouldn't we trust? And that ML may have a QA layer in there as well, of kind of like understanding that you may be filling in data. So if you have a blank data, if you have if you think of data as rows and columns, so if you have a cell that's blank, you may be able to fill it in. That's like a perfect example for a lot of ML to do that. And then you've got some sort of quality layer where you're really trying to go through the quality. And then, of course, you need to have some sort of delivery. So you want to be able to deliver that data in a way to your customer that their engineering team doesn't have to do a lot of work. So can you push it, let's say they're on Snowflake, could you push it natively into Snowflake? If they're on AWS, how do you make sure that they can access it without 20 different credential things going back and forth? How do you make sure, or do you have a smart API that is very, very easy for them to use? So how does that delivery work? Because you really want to save them time. That's not what's going to get you the sale, but that's what's going to keep a really happy customer.
Julia mentioned that we spend most of our time thinking about first-party data. I mean, that's hard enough to make sure that the quality is good, the reliability is good, all of this. But the task that you're describing sounds like either a giant challenge or a real pain in the ass, depending on where you
it's certainly a bit of both, but it's fun. It's a puzzle, right? And then if you're the type of person who is excited about getting facts correct, then you can kind of do that. Now, the nice thing about data that, at least for SafeGraph that we're looking at, is it's data about the physical world that you could actually go verify. Like you could literally go to that place in Waukesha, Wisconsin or something like that and go in there and go look around and verify that it's not that we do that often, but it's verifiable. And so that's the nice thing. Whereas there's certain other data sets, maybe you're dealing with like medical data or something, which you wouldn't necessarily be able to verify.
Yeah, the stakes are certainly higher because you're selling it, right? It's like if we have a data quality issue internally, like usually we identify it, we say, oh, whoops, I understand what went wrong, and we fix it.
You may have a workaround.
Yeah, like maybe it's lost time or some lost productivity for a bit, but generally speaking, like it's not so bad, it's fixable. But here you are, this is like you're selling that product.
Yeah, it's not that different from like internal tool versus external tool. I'm sure you guys have lots of internal tools and they're like super buggy and the UI is terrible and all this other stuff. And then you've got like you have
something
the external, you have the external things you're selling, and that has to be way more polished with great documentation and all those other types of things that are out there.
So one of the interesting trends that we're seeing is that we now have these like two big marketplaces that have been created by Snowflake and Databricks that are enabling both sellers and buyers to transact much more easily these data sets. And so it solves a lot of problems in the industry. For the consumer, you can now do discovery more easily. And for producers, you now have a channel for which you can sell your data on. In theory, we're still a little early on this journey, but in theory, like this should help there be a lot more exchange of data sets between producers and consumers. But it also opens up like a lot of challenges. We're talking about data quality is, something you have to really get right. How do you see the marketplaces evolving the trends in the data sharing and buying industry?
I think in theory, you're right. In practice, we haven't seen that yet. So the amount of data discovery and buying through all these marketplaces, and AWS has a marketplace, and Azure, there's lots of different marketplaces out there, is still probably well under 1% of all data transacting. So it's still very, 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 very tiny. It's a small blip. It's much more data is being transacted over Google search. So that's still, the much more of the dominant way that people are discovering than through any of these marketplaces. That might change in the future, but that hasn't yet been there. And there's still a lot of barriers to data. Every data set is different. How you describe that data is different. So it's very hard to normalize this data out there.
Got it. So most transactions are still happening directly between a buyer and a seller.
Definitely.
So who's verifying then that the data quality is like up to an acceptable level? Like you buy something, maybe you realize you bought something that wasn't that useful. It has some problems, but you don't have the benefit of a marketplace is like you could have reviews and you can see if they've gained traction. Yes. You have this market that decides whether this asset is worth buying. But if you go directly, I think that's a bit harder because you don't have someone governing and giving the credibility to anyone who wants to sell you data over the internet?
Exactly, a big problem right now. It's very hard to do these data evaluations, and data evaluations significantly slow down the sales process. So usually in a sales process, there's some sort of data evaluation that's happening where you're sending them some sort of data, they're looking at it. That can take a long time because how do you do that? The tools for that are hard. And that could be the biggest chunk of the sales process that's out there. And then the burden is on this company who's buying data, who may not really know how to evaluate it in the right way to go do that. So brands are important. So if they trust the brand, you say, I trust ZoomInfo or, whatever it might be. So those things, or I bought this in my other company, so I'll buy in this one or something. But those brands take a long time to build, especially for smaller companies, which is why a lot of people still buy these like legacy old school data companies like Dun & Bradstreet. Dun & Bradstreet has been around so long. Abraham Lincoln worked for Dun & Bradstreet. He actually worked there in the 1850s.
Oh my goodness.
So, I mean, you have these companies that have just been around for just a really long time. And part of the reason is because the brand is important. And so, if you think of these other companies that have been around for a while, Experian, et cetera, like they have a brand that, you have some sort of level of trust in, because if you're a startup, if you're a newer company like SafeGraph, you have to build that over time. And of course, the best way to build it is to have an excellent product. But that makes it building it much, much easier. But even if you have an excellent product, it just takes long periods of time to go do that. And if you think of G2 for software, which is a great tool if you want to evaluate software and you want to get in touch with people and see some reviews on things and, et cetera. G2 doesn't have a data piece of it yet. Hopefully they will, or, their company might do that in the future. And even if they do, I still think it's much harder to like review data than it is software. Because software, it's like if I'm selling a CRM to dentists, there's like a key buyer, which is like the office manager of the dentist or something. And you kind of understand that use case. And usually the software is like some sort of vertical. It's like I'm selling to marketers or whatever. Whereas data can be like a lot more horizontal. And so it may have lots of different use cases for the data. And some might work excellent in one use case, but not as well in another use case.
You were talking about the buying process before and quality makes it harder and all of this. It made me think it's not exactly clear to me. And maybe there's not a standard answer for this. You tell me, but it's not exactly clear to me what I get as a quote unquote buyer of data. Do I like own that data? Do I have a license to it? I assume I don't get the whole data set. I probably get some specific chunks of it. How does all this work? So
if you think of data as rows and columns, you're going to get certain rows that you care about and certain columns that you care about. And so those columns might be attributes. So that could be leads. I care about leads. Maybe you're selling into CIOs in Belgium or something. So those are the rows, CIOs in Belgium. And then maybe the columns are their phone number, their title, their email address. I don't know, whatever it is, their LinkedIn profile name, whatever. Those are the columns that you care about. And then you have a license to that data. And usually that license, let's say, is a year. And then at the end of that license, if you don't renew, you have to delete the data. So you have these different types of things. And of course, you don't have the right to resell the data because it's living in your servers.
The expectation of folks who are selling this particular data set is that like if somebody sent you a spreadsheet with this data in it, that you would just hit delete on the spreadsheet, empty recycle bin, and that you would never look at it again.
Usually, if you look at most data that you license, usually that's the terms of the license to be able to do that. Now, of course, if the data goes out of date, it doesn't matter. And so a lot of data is probably the more expensive data is temporal because you always need it. And then you're often getting updates anyway. So SafeGraph, our customers get a monthly update of that data as well because things are changing. If you think of like store hours, okay, in COVID, they were changing every day. But even now they change, every 3 to 4 months, you're going to see store hours change and stuff. So if you want to keep those up to date, you want to get updates on those types of things as well.
In the same way that software went through the like licensing model to the subscription model, data wants to be purchased on a subscription as well. Most data is purchased on now, you just might need a one-time cut of data because you're doing a project or something like that. Maybe you're a private equity firm and you're evaluating a specific investment and you just need some data right now about like
restaurant reviews in the state of Ohio or something. And then at the end of this project in a month, you don't care about it anymore. So then maybe a one-time cut is fine. But if it gets into a product, like an ongoing product, then you're going to want that data all the time. And you want that data coming into your systems. And those, of course, are the better data deals that are out there. It's just like you don't want to sell software and just sell it once. That probably means you're losing money. You want to have a long-term relationship with that customer because your CACs are still going to be relative. CACs in data or look like CACs in software. They're going to be pretty high. And so if you don't have a customer using that for many, many years, you're going to have a tough time becoming a profitable company.
Yeah, it sounds like probably the biggest challenge, though, is like the data is only useful for a period of time. So if you don't continue to renew your license or your subscription, like, yeah, you have a lot of data, but how useful is it to you in a year's time?
Yeah. And we train our salespeople to try to identify that up front, because if we have a customer that churns because they may have had a need for data, but they don't have an ongoing need for data, that is a very expensive sale for us. That's a customer that we've essentially lost money on if they churn a year later. So we really want customers that are going to take our data and they're going to use it internally. Now, of course, the burden's on us to make sure we're delivering them great data and that we're listening to their feedback and constantly making the data better and fulfilling their needs. So we have to continue to do a lot of work to make sure that we earn that customer's trust over long periods of time. But we need the ability to do that. If they only had a one-time thing in the first place, we're almost certainly not going to sell to them.
Yeah. As a former buyer of CapIQ data, they also would prevent me from exporting too much. So I could only get access to the data if I was using their APIs. But if I wanted to take a full database worth of stuff, I'd get limited. Auren, I want to go back to something that you talked about around brand building and how it takes a really long time to establish yourself as a vendor that sells high quality data. One of the things that I noticed in the industry is like a lot of these big companies that do sell data, they've been around for decades, 30 plus years. You mentioned Dun & Bradstreet as being like practically ancient. But I also noticed that there's only like a couple companies in each of the markets that have most of the market share. So you have like the financial firms that sell financial data. It's like S&P Global, FactSet, credit agencies. We have Equifax, TransUnion, and lots more companies that have just been around for a while. And they sell more than just data. They often have like software products as well, but they're pretty big companies. Like, you know, S&P Global, $100 billion company, tens of $billion company. They seem to have like a hold on their market. And it's usually like a duopoly in any industry that they have ownership of. Is it brand only, or it has to be more than that? Do they have like exclusive rights to data? Why is it that they have such a strong hold on their industry and it's been hard for new entrants to come in?
So first of all, you're exactly right. The data does tend to be a winner take most. It's often duopolies that kind of control a market. Two companies may have 90% plus market share. Or one company may have 60, 70% market share. Very, very different than software, which is way more competitive that's out there. And one of the things in software is like there's a UI, and that UI is often built for very, very different people. When you're selling data, if you're just selling facts, then it's like it kind of makes more sense that you're going to kind of get to a more winner take most type of scenario. And then often the way you make a customer happier with data is you give them more data. And so you keep getting more and more data. And so the more customers you have, the more you can invest in getting more and more data. And that, you know, initially you create data that like every customer wants, but at some point you're creating data that only like 2, 3, 4% of your customers really want, but it starts to add up. It's just like Netflix. Like they have these like obscure German shows that I love, but probably like most Americans don't.
Me too.
And so, you know, that's one of the reasons I keep going back, but they can afford to do that because they have a very, very large audience. And so it's somewhat hard to catch up.
For many of these traditional companies, I don't know, it's not worth going too deep here, but I don't think that they sold into people who were primarily running dbt and Airflow and Snowflake. How often are your data buyers on, you know, what we would call, quote unquote, the data team?
No, that's right. And so at least for SafeGraph, most of our customers are product and engineering teams. And by most is probably over 90%. our product and engineering teams that we sell into. Whereas a probably traditional data company might not be. They might be selling to more of a business buyer or something like that. The good news is selling to those, when you're selling into the product and eng teams, or maybe a core data science team or core ML team, their quality bar is much, much, much higher. And they're going to care about that much more. They're probably building some sort of model on top of that data, et cetera. And so if you're a tech first company, if you're a startup, if you're like an engineering oriented company that happens to be creating data, then you're probably going to do better selling into that more tech audience. Whereas like some of these traditional companies are probably going to be better selling into maybe more of the traditional buyer of the data.
I want to talk about something you mentioned around data co-ops. So not actually buying and selling data, but people exchanging data for the collective benefit of the group. So a classic one that I see a lot is like compensation data.
Yep.
You're very curious what the market is giving, where the market is for hiring people. So you, as a company, will contribute your compensation data. And in return, you get bands around the market gives this cash and equity for these roles. So that's a very classic data co-op that we see. Is that becoming more popular? Like who's running these data co-ops? How do you actually exchange data safely and securely? There is this like privacy risk also involved when you're sharing things. You need to aggregate things responsibly. Tell us more about data co-ops.
Data co-ops are super powerful and you get to winner take most really fast because it's kind of a marketplace. And they can kind of happen top down or bottoms up. So you can kind of cut top down. You can go to the top companies in the space and you can say, hey, why don't you all share data about fraud or something? And if we all share data, we all put into this one bucket, then we can reduce fraud as an industry quite a bit. And so there's lots of those types of data co-ops. Maybe one of the more famous one is Verisk. And they have all this insurance data that gets kind of put into a co-op, and then they can help understand, maybe transactions that look similar or fraudulent. And that's something where you do need an external company because you're not allowed to like share data between competitors. It could be anti-competitive pretty quickly. So you do need some sort of external company. In Verisk's case, it was actually owned by the insurance companies for many, many years. So it was almost like a nonprofit that was owned by them. So you see those all the time. You see them a lot in the financial services industry, and you see them in many, many other industries that are out there. And then you have the bottoms up data co-ops. You mentioned like these payroll type of things where, okay, I have a senior engineer. What should I pay the senior engineer? Of course, like in these bottoms up things, one of the hard things is just like normalizing all that data. Okay, well, I have a senior engineer, you have a senior engineer. Are they the same type of person or a very different type of person, right?
Put them all in a level 7.
Yeah, exactly. So like these things are really hard to start, but there might be some sort of ways to do that. So here's an example of like a business idea for your listeners. You can get all these small businesses to auth in their QuickBooks. And then every time they are thinking about having a customer, you could tell them, what are the average days outstanding that these customers pay? Let's say you're a small design agency and you can't take on too many customers, and you've got Ford and GM, and you're going to charge them both $100,000 for a product for your services. And Ford pays within 15 days and GM pays within 90 days on average. Okay, well, you're going to go with Ford, right? And so that could be a really nice little thing where like if everybody aggregates that information, it can work really well. And there's lots of little data co-ops, even in other products. So if you think of like a spam filter like Gmail is a data co-op. Every time you click on spam, it informs everybody and it makes everyone better. So there's tons of data co-ops like embedded into products already to make all of our lives better.
You ended up building a business around location data, which I think is a market that's not very saturated yet. Maybe it's very hard to get this data. Why did you pick location data? And do you see any other opportunities of hard to get data sets that the market would really like to procure?
Well, if you're building data business, you should build it around one of the 4 nouns first. Sometimes people say, I'm going to build it around 3 of the 4, 4 out of the 4. So I think you should choose one: people, places, organizations, or things, right? Choose a noun. Of course, you're already going to start to cross it with other things, but choose a noun where like everything is around that one noun. So we wanted to get into the data business. We started looking at the other nouns, and we chose places for various reasons, but mainly because a lot of us were map nerds and we kind of were interested in geo, and it's just kind of fun and looked interesting. And it's already a pretty big area, so it's already a fairly big business. It's much bigger than, for instance, like data about companies and organizations. And there's ways of like standardizing it and doing some other types of things. Once you pick a noun, and then of course you're not just going to do everything in that noun. Let's say you did data about people. Okay, you're not going to have data about every single person in the world and every attribute about every person, right? That would be trillions and trillions of data points that are out there. You're usually doing some sort of subset. Like when ZoomInfo started, they start with like a really tiny subset of like IT managers in the US, and they curated it with like people really going really, really deep. And so really trying to find that like niche that you start with. And then of course, over time, you're going to grow the rows, and then you're also going to grow the columns over time.
That makes sense. Start with a good insertion point, get really, really good because data quality matters.
Data quality matters. So I think in the old days, especially in marketing, people were really selling breadth. And in marketing, it's okay to have data with lower quality. If your data is like 50% accurate, 40% accurate, like most marketing data, that's actually fine. It's like way better than throwing darts. Most marketing, even on like something like gender's usually like 70, 75% accurate. So it's maybe 50% better than throwing a dart or something. And that's going to be just fine for most marketing data, because it doesn't really matter if it's wrong. But if you're focusing on data that you really need to be right, well, then you really want to focus on a much smaller data set so that you can control that it's correct, because it's pretty expensive to get it right. You have to spend a lot of time, a lot of engineering effort, a lot of other effort to really make sure that that data is correct. So you want to start with a fairly high value piece of data and then slowly grow it, because the way you're going to go against the incumbents is quality.
That makes sense. So we're going to wrap up here. We ask this to all our guests, but looking 10 years out, what do you hope will be true for the data industry?
Well, I think to truly solve society's problems, we just need to open up a lot more data. And I think this is especially true in things like medical and health world. I think that has the potential to triple or even quadruple health outcomes. There's lots of other data that we need to open up much more. If we have data about people data is harder to open up because of all the privacy things, but we can create synthetic data. We can use homomorphic encryption. There's lots of other ways to be able to potentially share data in a very, very privacy safe way without actually hurting people's privacy. So I would like to see a lot more data opened so that we can really tackle the biggest problems that are affecting our society.
I love that answer. I also feel like it's one of those things that, Kaggle released their open datasets product, 4 or 5 years ago. It was going to be huge, and then it did. Anyway, what is keeping us from doing that today? Because we're not really doing it.
I think the biggest thing is often there's these very large players out there that do everything possible to make sure that the data isn't out there, because they're getting some sort of rent from the data. And so they'll try to scare people in Congress, or they'll try to do other types of things saying like, we shouldn't make this data available. And, we literally would be saving like millions of lives if we just open up some of this data more, especially the medical data. And there's this trope that like you can't open up the data because it could hurt people's privacy, but there are ways to do it. We can have our cake and eat it too. There are ways to create synthetic data. And just because we didn't do it well 20 years ago, like there was this point where we opened up all the AOL searches 20 years ago, and like someone like searched for like, how do I kill my wife
that person in
or
Florida
something?
Or something.
Yeah. And, and then they were able to like identify that person and stuff like that. We've come a long way in technology of how to anonymize data today. We can do that in a much safer way today than we could before. And if we did do that, just opening up to all the research, opening up to all academics. If you think of the IRS data, which is this incredible, great longitudinal data study of hundreds of millions of people.
And there's like 5 academics who have access to that, right?
Exactly. There's only like 5 people. One of them is Raj Chetty, who's one of the best, most incredible economists in the world. He's writing incredible papers, and I love reading his papers, just so insightful. But why do we only have 5? Why don't we have like 5 million or at least 50,000? Maybe they have to like fill out some sort of test or something to have access to this data. Now, yeah, do we want to give them the underlying data? No, absolutely not. That data is very, very, very sensitive, but we can create synthetic data, or we can give them access to query the data in a way where they wouldn't see the underlying data. That's what we have to, as a society, we really should be pushing that. Then we're going to really open up a lot of opportunities and really solve a lot of really, really interesting problems. Like today, we don't even know if like chocolate cake is good for you or bad for you. Like we don't know anything, right? All that stuff we could know with a little bit more data.
Great place to end on chocolate cake. Auren Hoffman, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate being on the podcast.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs and is hosted by Tristan Handy and myself, Julia Schottenstein. Have comments, questions, or guest suggestions? Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com. Our producers are Jeff Fox and David Krevitt. If you enjoy the show, please drop a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.